December 7th, 1941, 7:52 in the morning. The third deck of the USS West Virginia smelled of laundry soap and diesel oil. Mess attendant, third class. Doris Miller stood beside a metal basin, his hands moving through the mechanical rhythm of folding officers' uniforms, white shirts, dark trousers, the repetitive geometry of cloth transformed into order. Above him, through layers of steel and corridor, the Hawaiian sun was climbing over Pearl Harbor. The water outside glittered like shattered glass. 8 battleships sat in silence along what the sailors called Battleship Row, their hulls dark and massive, their crews moving slowly through Sunday morning routines. Church services would begin soon. Breakfast mess had just ended. In the galleys, cooks scraped griddles clean, while junior mess attendants like Miller scrubbed pans until their arms ached. Miller was 22 years old. He'd been folding laundry for the United States Navy since 1939, when he left Waco, Texas, looking for something more than sharecropping and Depression-era hunger. The Navy had promised him travel, steady pay, and a chance to send money home to his family. What it gave him instead was a mop, a broom, and a battle station in a magazine room that no longer existed. He didn't know it yet, but in 3 minutes, the world would catch fire. At 7:55, the air above Oahu split open with the scream of dive bombers. 183 aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy's First Air Fleet tore through the morning sky in perfect formation, their engines drowning out every other sound. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers swept low over the water. Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers climbed and rolled, their payload bays open. Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters circled like hawks, waiting for anything that moved. The first torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma at 7:56. The second hit the USS West Virginia 90 seconds later. Miller felt it before he heard it. The deck beneath his feet lurched sideways. The basin of soapy water tipped, spilling across the floor. Then came the sound, a deep, bone-shaking concussion that travelled through the hull like thunder compressed into metal. The lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to wail. He dropped the shirt in his hands and ran. The general quarters klaxons screamed through every corridor. Battle stations. All hands. Battle stations. Miller's station was an anti-aircraft battery magazine amidships, a small armoured room where ammunition was stored and passed to the gunners above. He sprinted through the passageways, dodging other sailors who were running in every direction, some half-dressed, some carrying rifles they didn't know how to load. When he reached the magazine, it wasn't there. A torpedo had torn through the port side of the ship exactly where his battle station should have been. In its place was a gaping wound of twisted steel, seawater, pouring in with the force of a collapsing dam. The compartment was flooding. Men were screaming. The ship was already beginning to list. Miller stood there, breathless, staring at the hole where his duty should have been. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. No station, no orders, nothing to do but find a life vest and abandon ship. But Doris Miller had spent 2 years aboard the West Virginia. He knew every inch of her decks. He knew the men who served on her, and somewhere above him, through the smoke and fire, the ship was still fighting. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The USS West Virginia had been commissioned in 1923, one of the so-called standard-type battleships that formed the backbone of the United States Pacific Fleet. She displaced 32,600 tons. Her main battery consisted of 8 14-inch guns mounted in 4 turrets. Her secondary armament included a dozen 5-inch guns, 8 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and numerous smaller caliber machine guns scattered across her superstructure. On the morning of December 7th, she was moored outboard of the USS Tennessee at berth F6, the southernmost position on Battleship Row. To her port side lay open water. To her starboard, the Tennessee sat protected by the West Virginia's bulk. This positioning would prove catastrophic. Every torpedo that couldn't reach the Tennessee struck the West Virginia instead. By 7:57, the ship had been hit by 5 Mark 13 torpedoes, each carrying over 500 pounds of high explosive. The blasts tore through her port side below the waterline, rupturing fuel tanks, flooding compartments, and killing dozens of men in the lower decks before they even knew they were under attack. 2 armor-piercing bombs followed, one of which detonated near the command tower, igniting fires that would burn for hours. Captain Mervyn Benyon stood on the navigation bridge, giving orders even as shrapnel from a nearby explosion tore through his abdomen. He was the ship's commanding officer, a 53-year-old career naval officer who had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1910. He refused to leave his post. He refused morphine. He kept issuing commands, his voice steady despite the blood soaking through his uniform. Miller didn't know any of this when he climbed the ladder toward the bridge. He only knew that someone had shouted for help and that the ship was sinking and that his battle station no longer existed. So he went where he was needed. When he reached the bridge, the scene was chaos. Smoke poured through the shattered windows. Fires burned on the deck below, fed by oil leaking from ruptured tanks. The air stank of cordite and burning paint. Men shouted over the roar of explosions and the shriek of incoming aircraft. Captain Benyon lay near the port side of the bridge, his face pale, his breathing shallow. 2 officers knelt beside him, trying to stop the bleeding with their hands. Miller dropped to his knees and helped lift the captain, carrying him away from the exposed position behind the conning tower. Benyon's blood soaked into Miller's shirt. The captain muttered something about the ship's status, about damage reports, about orders that needed to be relayed. He was dying, but he refused to stop commanding. They moved him to a safer position, but there was no safety anywhere on the bridge. Bullets from strafing Japanese fighters ripped through the superstructure. Bombs detonated in the water nearby, sending geysers of spray across the deck. The ship listed further to port, her starboard side rising out of the water as thousands of tons of seawater flooded her compartments. Lieutenant Frederick White grabbed Miller by the shoulder. The anti-aircraft guns. Someone needed to man the anti-aircraft guns. Most of the gun crews were dead or wounded. The Japanese planes were circling back for another pass. If they didn't return fire, the ship would be defenseless. Miller had never fired an anti-aircraft gun in his life. In 1941, the United States Navy was a segregated institution. Black sailors like Doris Miller were restricted to the messman branch, a designation that limited them to roles as cooks, stewards, and servants. They served meals to white officers, they cleaned berthing areas, they polished brass and scrubbed decks. They were explicitly excluded from gunnery training, fire control training, and any combat role that might place them in positions of authority over white personnel. The Navy's reasoning was rooted in the racial ideology of the era. Military leadership believed that black men lacked the intelligence and discipline required for technical combat roles. They were considered suitable only for menial labor, the kind of work that required physical strength but no strategic thinking, gunnery, navigation, engineering. These were reserved for white sailors who had access to training schools and advancement opportunities that black sailors could only imagine. Miller had never touched a Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun before December 7th. He had watched gun crews operate them during training drills, standing at a distance, invisible in his white mess attendant uniform. He had seen the way they loaded the ammunition belts, the way they adjusted the elevation and traverse, the way they tracked targets across the sky. But he had never been allowed to participate. Now, with the ship burning and the sky filled with enemy aircraft, Lieutenant White pointed him toward an unmanned gun mount on the starboard side of the bridge. Miller climbed into the gunner's seat. The weapon was massive, a belt-fed machine gun mounted on a pedestal that allowed 360 degrees of rotation. The barrel was over 4 feet long. The ammunition feed came from a metal can bolted to the side of the mount. The trigger mechanism was simple, a butterfly grip with thumb triggers on each handle. He gripped the handles, swung the barrel toward the sky, and opened fire. The gun roared, the recoil hammered against his shoulders. Spent shell casings flew from the ejection port, clattering onto the deck in a metallic rain. Tracers arced through the air, bright orange streaks that cut through the smoke and converged on the silhouettes of Japanese aircraft. Miller had no formal training, No instructor had taught him how to lead a moving target or compensate for wind drift. But he had instinct. He had watched. And he had the kind of clarity that only comes when everything else has been stripped away. A Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber roared overhead, so low that Miller could see the pilot's face through the canopy. He swung the gun, tracked the aircraft, and fired a sustained burst. The tracers walked across the fuselage. The plane shuddered, trailing smoke, and veered away. Another plane. Another burst. The belt of ammunition fed through the gun in a continuous stream, each round igniting as it left the barrel. The noise was deafening. The heat radiating from the barrel made the air shimmer. Miller's hands were slick with sweat, his muscles trembling from the effort of controlling the weapon's recoil. For 15 minutes, he fired without stopping. He didn't think about the fact that he wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't think about the regulations that said black sailors weren't capable of manning combat stations. He only thought about the planes screaming overhead and the men dying around him. Witnesses would later report that Miller shot down at least one Japanese aircraft, possibly more. The official Navy record credited him with one confirmed kill. Miller himself would claim he downed 4 to 6 planes, though the chaos of battle made precise accounting impossible. What mattered wasn't the number. What mattered was that he fought. At 8:10, the USS Arizona exploded. A bomb had penetrated her forward magazine, detonating over 1 million pounds of gunpowder in a single catastrophic blast. The fireball rose 1,000 feet into the air. The shockwave rattled windows in Honolulu, 10 miles away. 1,177 men died in an instant. Miller saw the explosion from the bridge of the West Virginia. For a moment, the entire harbor was illuminated in orange and white, a brightness that seared itself into memory. Then the darkness returned, and with it the sound of engines and gunfire and screams. The West Virginia was sinking. Counterflooding measures had slowed the list, but water continued to pour into the ruptured compartments. The fires on deck were spreading. Ammunition for the 5-inch guns was cooking off, sending secondary explosions through the superstructure. The order came to abandon ship. Miller fired until the ammunition can ran dry. Then he climbed down from the gun mount and began helping wounded sailors evacuate. Some were burned so badly that their uniforms had fused to their skin. Others had compound fractures, shrapnel wounds, injuries that would have been fatal if not for the men who carried them to safety. He pulled sailors from oil-slicked water. He dragged unconscious men across the deck. He was one of the last 3 to leave the ship, refusing to go until there was no one left to save. Captain Mervyn Bennion died on the bridge of the West Virginia at approximately 8:30. He never left his post. His last words were orders, transmitted through officers who relayed them to sailors fighting to save the ship he commanded. By 9:30, the attack was over. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. 21 ships had been sunk or damaged. 2,403 Americans were dead. Another 1,178 were wounded. Doris. Miller stood on the deck of a rescue boat, soaked in seawater and oil. His hands blistered from the heat of the machine gun. Around him, Pearl Harbor burned. The water was covered in a thick layer of fuel oil, flames dancing across its surface. Bodies floated among the wreckage. The smell of smoke and death hung in the air like a shroud. He didn't know that his actions would remain classified for months. He didn't know that the Navy would refuse to release his name, identifying him only as an unnamed Negro messman in initial reports. He didn't know that it would take a campaign by the black press, led by journalists who demanded recognition for his heroism, to force the military to acknowledge what he had done. All he knew was that the ship was gone, the men were dead, and the war had finally come to America. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of the Pearl Harbor attack became clear. The Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise. Their pilots had executed a meticulously planned operation with devastating precision. Of the 8 battleships moored at Pearl Harbor, 4 were sunk and 4 were damaged. The Arizona would never sail again. The Oklahoma had capsized. The West Virginia rested on the harbor bottom, her superstructure still visible above the waterline. But the attack had also failed in crucial ways. The Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga had been at sea during the raid. They survived intact and would form the backbone of America's carrier-based counteroffensive in the months to come. The Japanese had also neglected to target Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, repair facilities, and submarine base, all of which remained operational. Most importantly, the attack galvanized American public opinion. Isolationism, which had dominated American political discourse throughout the 1930s, evaporated overnight. On December 8, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appeared before a joint session of Congress and declared December 7, a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The war that Doris Miller had been trying to avoid had found him anyway. For more than 3 months, Miller's identity remained a mystery. The Navy's official reports mentioned an unnamed messman who had distinguished himself during the attack, but provided no details. The black community, already skeptical of military institutions that systematically excluded them from recognition, grew increasingly frustrated. Lawrence Reddick, the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, began an investigation. He wrote to the Navy Department requesting that the sailor's name be released so that it could be added to the center's honor roll of race relations. The Navy complied. On March 12, 1942, Reddick announced that the unnamed hero was Doris Miller, a 22-year-old mess attendant from Texas. The black press erupted. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and dozens of other newspapers ran front-page stories about the cook who had manned a machine gun and fought back against the Japanese attack. Miller became a symbol, proof that black Americans were capable of the same courage and competence as their white counterparts, if only they were given the opportunity. On April 1, 1942, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox officially commended Miller for his actions. The commendation was carefully worded, acknowledging his bravery while avoiding any suggestion that the Navy's segregation policies might be unjust. But commendations were not enough. Across the country, civil rights organizations, religious leaders, and members of Congress began calling for Miller to receive the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. Congressman John Dingell of Michigan and Senator James Meade of New York formally nominated him. Editorials demanded that the Navy recognize Miller's actions with the same honor it would bestow on a white sailor who had performed identical feats. The Navy refused. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, presented Miller with the Navy Cross aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, anchored in Pearl Harbor. The Navy Cross was the third highest decoration for valor at the time, ranking below the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Medal. It was a significant honor, but it was not the recognition that many believed Miller deserved. The citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge. It was the first time in the war that a black sailor had received such high recognition in the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz himself acknowledged the significance, stating, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Miller stood on the deck of the Enterprise, the medal pinned to his chest, and said nothing. He had been promoted to mess attendant first class, then to cook third class, a minor advancement that did nothing to change the fundamental reality of his role in the Navy. He was still a messman, still segregated, still serving meals while white sailors half his age were trained for combat roles. The war had changed everything, but it had changed nothing. The ceremony aboard the Enterprise lasted 20 minutes. Photographers captured Miller standing at attention, the Navy Cross gleaming on his uniform. Admirals shook his hand. Officers offered congratulations. Then the cameras were packed away, the reporters departed, and Miller returned to the galley to prepare the evening meal. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. He had proven himself capable under fire, had operated complex weaponry without training, had saved lives while risking his own. Yet the Navy's response was to promote him one rank within the same restricted branch and send him back to the kitchen. The message was clear. Heroism did not erase the color line. In June of 1942, Miller was assigned to the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. He served aboard her for 17 months, cooking meals and cleaning officers' quarters, while the ship participated in operations across the Pacific. The Indianapolis escorted convoys, supported amphibious landings, and engaged in surface actions against Japanese forces. Miller watched these operations from below deck, folding laundry while other men fought. The irony was not lost on him, nor on the black community that had embraced him as a symbol. Here was a man who had proven his courage beyond question, relegated once again to servitude, while the Navy recruited and trained hundreds of thousands of white sailors for combat roles. Letters poured into the Navy Department demanding his transfer to a combat billet. Civil rights organizations used his story to argue for the integration of the armed forces. Miller himself said nothing publicly, but those who knew him reported a quiet frustration, a sense that his moment of heroism had been filed away and forgotten. The Navy's position was rooted in a policy that predated the war by decades. Since the late 19th century, black sailors had been systematically excluded from technical ratings and combat positions. The rationale shifted over time, from overt claims of racial inferiority to more bureaucratic justifications about unit cohesion and training efficiency. But the result remained the same. By 1941, nearly all of the Navy's 14,000 black enlisted men served in the messman branch. This policy was not merely discriminatory, it was strategically foolish. As the war expanded across the Pacific, the Navy faced a critical shortage of trained personnel. Thousands of ships needed crews. Gunnery stations sat unmanned. Yet, rather than tap the pool of capable black sailors, the Navy maintained its segregation policies and struggled to fill combat billets with undertrained white recruits. The contradiction became even more stark as the war progressed. In April of 1942, just weeks before Miller received his Navy Cross, Secretary Knox announced the opening of the first all-black naval training facility at Great Lakes, Illinois. The facility would train black recruits for general service ratings, a small step toward integration, but one that still maintained strict segregation and limited advancement opportunities. Miller became the face of this incremental change. The Navy sent him on a war bond tour in late 1942 and early 1943, parading him before crowds in cities across America. He appeared at rallies in Oakland, Los Angeles, and his hometown of Waco. He spoke to packed auditoriums, his presence alone serving as a recruiting tool. The message was carefully calibrated. Black Americans could serve with honor, could fight with courage, could contribute to victory. Join the Navy, buy war bonds, support the war effort. What the Navy did not say was that black recruits would face the same limitations Miller had faced. They would be trained, yes, but primarily for mess duty and steward service. They would serve on ships, but rarely in combat roles. They would be segregated, in training, in berthing, in advancement opportunities. Miller's heroism was real, but it had not changed the system that confined him. By the autumn of 1943, Miller had grown weary of the war bond circuit. He requested transfer back to sea duty. The Navy complied, assigning him to the escort carrier USS Liscum Bay, a small flat-top that had been commissioned earlier that year. The Liscum Bay was part of Carrier Division 24, assigned to provide air support for amphibious operations in the Central Pacific. In November of 1943, the Liscum Bay joined Task Force 52 for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, a chain of atolls 2,000 miles southwest of Hawaii. The operation, codenamed Galvanic, was intended to seize Tarawa and Makin atolls as stepping stones toward the Marshall Islands and eventually Japan itself. The invasion of Makin began on November 20th. The Liscum Bay's aircraft provided close air support for the Army's 165th Regimental Combat Team as they fought to secure the atoll against Japanese defenders. The fighting was brutal. Japanese forces, though outnumbered, fought from prepared positions and refused to surrender. It took 3 days to secure Macon, 3 days during which the Liscum Bay circled offshore, launching and recovering aircraft vulnerable to submarine attack. The Japanese submarine I-175 had been prowling the waters around Macon for days, waiting for an opportunity. Commander Sunao Tabata commanded the boat with patience and precision. He tracked the American task force, plotting firing solutions, waiting for the moment when the carriers would be most exposed. That moment came just before dawn, on November 24, 1943. At 5:13 in the morning, the I-175 fired a spread of torpedoes at the Liscum Bay from a range of 1,400 yards. One torpedo struck the carrier on the starboard side, directly adjacent to the aircraft bomb storage magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The bomb magazine detonated, triggering a secondary blast that tore the ship apart from the inside out. The fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The carrier's flight deck buckled and collapsed. Men were thrown overboard by the force of the explosion. Others were incinerated instantly. The Liscum Bay sank in 23 minutes. Of the ship's complement of 916 men, 644 were killed or went missing. Among the dead were Rear Admiral Henry Mullenix, Captain Irving Wiltsey, and Mess Attendant First Class Doris Miller. Miller's body was never recovered. He was officially declared dead on November 25, 1943. He was 24 years old. The Navy did not immediately announce Miller's death. News of casualties from the Gilbert Islands campaign trickled back to the United States slowly, filtered through censorship and delayed by the vast distances of the Pacific Theater. It wasn't until weeks later that Miller's family in Waco received the telegram informing them that their son was missing in action and presumed dead. The black press mourned him as a hero and a symbol of wasted potential. Editorials noted the bitter irony that Miller had survived Pearl Harbor only to die on another ship, still serving in a role far below his proven capabilities. He had been given a medal, he had been paraded before crowds, but he had never been given the opportunity to serve as the warrior he had shown himself to be. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Navy's treatment of Doris Miller reflected broader patterns in how the American military confronted race during World War II. The armed forces entered the war deeply segregated, operating under policies that explicitly codified racial hierarchy. Black soldiers served in separate units, often commanded by white officers. Black sailors were restricted to menial roles. The Marine Corps didn't accept black recruits at all until 1942, and even then kept them in segregated units assigned primarily to labor battalions. These policies were justified through a combination of pseudo-scientific racism and pragmatic concerns about unit cohesion. Military leadership argued that integration would undermine morale, that white servicemen would refuse to serve alongside black troops, that the presence of black personnel in combat roles would somehow compromise military effectiveness. These arguments ignored the reality that black troops had served with distinction in every American conflict since the Revolutionary War, and that segregation itself created inefficiencies and morale problems. The contradiction became increasingly difficult to sustain as the war progressed. The manpower demands of a global conflict forced the military to expand its use of black personnel, if only out of necessity. The army began assigning black units to combat roles in Italy and France. The Navy slowly opened additional ratings to black sailors. The Marine Corps, having reluctantly accepted black recruits, found that they performed as well as white Marines when given proper training and equipment. Miller's story became a touchstone in arguments for integration. Civil rights organizations pointed to him as evidence that black Americans were fully capable of serving in combat roles if given the opportunity. The NAACP used his example in its campaigns to pressure the Roosevelt administration to reform military racial policies. Labor leader A. Philip Randolph invoked Miller's name when threatening a march on Washington to protest discrimination in defense industries. Yet Miller himself had been given no such opportunity. His moment of heroism at Pearl Harbor had been an accident of circumstance, a convergence of crisis and capability that forced the Navy to acknowledge what it preferred to deny. In the aftermath, the institution had done everything possible to contain that acknowledgement, to frame Miller's actions as exceptional rather than representative, to ensure that his example did not become a precedent. The Navy's reasoning was transparent. If a black sailor with no gunnery training could operate an anti-aircraft weapon effectively under combat conditions, it raised uncomfortable questions about the rationale for excluding black sailors from such roles in the first place. If Miller could perform with distinction in a moment of crisis, perhaps thousands of other black sailors could do the same if given training and opportunity. The entire edifice of naval segregation rested on the assumption that black men were inherently unsuited for technical and combat roles. Miller had exposed that assumption as a lie, so the Navy gave him a medal, sent him on a publicity tour, and then returned him to the galley. It was a solution that allowed the institution to claim it, recognized merit, while preserving the racial hierarchy that defined its culture. The pattern repeated across the military. Black pilots trained at Tuskegee proved themselves among the most skilled aviators in the Army Air Forces, yet faced constant skepticism and were assigned to inferior equipment until they had no choice but to succeed despite institutional obstacles. The 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black unit that fought in Italy, was criticized by white commanders for poor performance, even as those same commanders failed to provide adequate training, supplies, or leadership. The 761st Tank Battalion fought across Europe with distinction, yet received little recognition until decades after the war. In each case, black servicemen had to prove themselves not once but repeatedly, overcoming not only the enemy but also the prejudices of their own military. And, in nearly every case, their achievements were downplayed, their failures magnified, their stories buried or forgotten in the decades that followed. Miller's death in 1943 meant he would not live to see the slow, painful progress toward integration that followed the war. He would not witness President Truman's 1948 executive order mandating the desegregation of the armed forces. He would not see the Korean War, where integrated units fought side by side and proved that black and white troops could serve together effectively. He would not live to see the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, which built in part on the foundation laid by black veterans who returned from World War II, determined to claim the full rights of citizenship they had fought to defend. But his story did not end with his death. In the years that followed, Miller became a symbol that transcended his individual life. The Navy named a destroyer escort after him in 1973, the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate that served for 2 decades. Schools across the country were named in his honor. Monuments were erected. In 2020, the Navy announced that a Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, the most advanced capital ship in the fleet, would bear his name, the USS Doris Miller, scheduled for commissioning in 2032. It would be the first aircraft carrier in American history named for an enlisted sailor, and the first named for a black American. These honors came decades too late for Miller himself, but they reflected a broader reckoning with the military's racial past. As the civil rights movement forced American institutions to confront their histories of discrimination, the armed forces slowly acknowledged the contributions of black servicemen who had been written out of official narratives or relegated to footnotes. The process was neither quick nor complete. It took until the 1990s for the Pentagon to conduct a systematic review of Medal of Honor awards and identify instances where racial prejudice had influenced the process. That review led to the posthumous upgrading of Distinguished Service Crosses to Medals of Honor for 21 Asian American soldiers who had served in World War II, nearly all of them members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Similar reviews identified black veterans whose heroism had been overlooked or deliberately minimized. Miller was not among those whose awards were upgraded. His Navy Cross remained the highest decoration he would receive, a testament to the limits of posthumous recognition. The Medal of Honor he had been denied in life would not be granted in death, despite multiple campaigns by historians, veterans organizations, and civil rights groups. The reasons for this continued denial were complex. Some argued that the threshold for the Medal of Honor was extraordinarily high, that Miller's actions, while heroic, did not quite meet the standard of sustained valor under fire that the medal required. Others suggested that upgrading his award, so many decades after the fact, would be a symbolic gesture that accomplished little. Still, others suspected that institutional resistance remained, that even in the 21st century, the military was reluctant to fully confront the ways in which racial prejudice had shaped its recognition systems. What could not be denied was the impact Miller's story had on subsequent generations. For Black Americans growing up in the 1940s and 50s, Doris Miller was proof that their contributions mattered, that heroism transcended race, that the fight for equality was worth pursuing. For military historians, his story became a case study in how institutions resist change and how individual acts of courage can challenge systemic injustice. The morning of December 7, 1941, had revealed something the Navy preferred to keep hidden: that competence and courage were not the province of any single race, that the policies designed to exclude Black Americans from combat roles were built on prejudice rather than evidence, that the war could not be won if half the nation's manpower was relegated to menial labor based solely on the color of their skin. Miller had not set out to be a symbol. He had simply done what needed to be done when his ship was burning and his shipmates were dying. He had picked up a weapon he was never trained to use and fought back with everything he had. And in doing so, he had exposed the lie at the heart of naval segregation. The Navy gave him a medal and sent him back to the galley, but it could not erase what he had proven. It could not undo the fact that thousands of people had witnessed his courage. It could not prevent his story from spreading, from inspiring, from becoming a rallying cry for those who demanded change. In the end, the institution that had tried to contain Doris Miller's legacy could not control it. His story outlived the policies that sought to diminish him. His name became synonymous with a moment when necessity forced the Navy to acknowledge a truth it had spent decades denying. And though he died young, killed by an enemy torpedo on a cold November morning in the Pacific, his impact on American military culture would resonate for generations. The ships that bore his name sailed under the same flag that had once relegated him to servitude. The schools named in his honor taught children who would never know the segregated military he had served. The monuments erected to his memory stood in a nation that, however imperfectly, had moved beyond the assumptions that defined his era. These changes came too late for Miller, but they came, in part, because of him. Part 3. The Cost of Truth. The USS Liscum Bay went down in the pre-dawn darkness of November 24, 1943, taking 644 men with her. The survivors, 332 in total, spent hours in the water waiting for rescue. Some clung to wreckage, others floated in life vests, watching as sharks circled in the warm Pacific currents. The destroyer USS Morris and other escort vessels eventually pulled them from the sea, hypothermic and traumatized, but alive. Doris Miller was not among them. The official casualty report listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. His family received the telegram on December 7, 1943, exactly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. The timing was cruel but unintentional, a bureaucratic coincidence that made the loss feel doubly significant. Henrietta Miller, his mother, kept the telegram in a drawer for the rest of her life, unable to throw it away or to look at it for very long. The black press published obituaries that mourned not just Miller's death, but what it represented. The Pittsburgh Courier ran an editorial titled "A Hero Wasted," arguing that Miller should have been training gunners or serving in a combat billet rather than cooking meals on a carrier. The Chicago Defender published photographs of Miller receiving the Navy Cross alongside a column asking why the Navy had never allowed him to fully use the skills he had demonstrated under fire. These criticisms were not new. They had been voiced throughout Miller's brief period of fame, during the war bond tours and medal ceremonies. But his death gave them renewed urgency. Here was a man who had proven his capability beyond doubt, yet the institution he served had refused to acknowledge that capability except in the most limited terms. He had been given recognition, but not opportunity, honor but not advancement, a medal but not trust. In Waco, Texas, Miller's community gathered to mourn. A memorial service was held at the New Hope Baptist Church, the same church where Miller had attended services as a child. His family sat in the front pew, his mother wearing black, his father silent and stoic. The pastor spoke of sacrifice and service, of a young man who had done his duty despite facing injustice at every turn. The service was attended not only by black residents of Waco, but also by some white citizens who recognized Miller's story as one that transcended racial boundaries. The local newspaper, which had largely ignored Miller during his life, published a respectful obituary acknowledging his heroism at Pearl Harbor. It was a small gesture, but in 1943, Texas, even small gestures across the color line carried weight. The Navy sent no representative to the service. No officers attended. No official acknowledgement came from the Department of the Navy beyond the standard condolence letter sent to families of the deceased. Miller had been newsworthy when he could be used for propaganda purposes. In death, he was just another casualty, one of hundreds of thousands who would not return from the Pacific. But the absence of official recognition did not diminish Miller's impact on the community that claimed him. In the years immediately following his death, Waco's black community established scholarships in his name, organized annual commemorations on December 7th, and ensured that local schoolchildren learned his story. He became part of the oral history passed from generation to generation, a reminder that heroism could emerge from the most constrained circumstances. This pattern repeated across Black America. In cities where Miller had appeared during his war bond tour, communities held memorial services and established local tributes. Veterans organizations made his story central to their advocacy for military integration. Civil rights leaders invoked his name when arguing that Black Americans deserved full citizenship, having proven their patriotism in blood. The broader narrative of World War II, however, largely forgot him. The popular histories written in the decades after the war focused on white heroes: Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier of the war; Jimmy Doolittle, who led the first bombing raid on Tokyo; Douglas MacArthur, who promised to return to the Philippines, and did. These men became household names, their stories told and retold in books, films, and television programs. Miller's story, when it appeared at all, was relegated to footnotes or specialized histories of the black military experience. The mainstream narrative of Pearl Harbor focused on the surprise of the attack, the sinking of the Arizona, and the famous photograph of the flag being raised over the wreckage. The unnamed cook who had manned a machine gun was, if mentioned, presented as a curiosity rather than a central figure. This erasure was not accidental. The story of World War II, as told in the 1950s and 60s, was one of national unity, of a generation that came together to defeat fascism. Acknowledging the reality of military segregation, of black servicemen fighting not only the Axis but also the racism of their own country, complicated that narrative. It was easier to tell a simplified story of American heroism than to confront the contradictions embedded in that heroism. The civil rights movement of the 1960s began to challenge these simplified narratives. As activists pushed for integration and equal rights, they pointed to the military service of black Americans as evidence of their claim to full citizenship. The WWII campaign, Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, had been a rallying cry during the war itself. Now, 2 decades later, veterans of that war were demanding that America live up to the ideals it had fought to defend. Miller's story became part of this broader argument. Civil rights organizations published pamphlets detailing his heroism and the Navy's failure to properly recognize it. College students studying black history encountered his name in textbooks that were beginning to include voices and stories previously excluded. The generation that came of age in the 1960s and 70s learned that the greatest generation had also been a deeply flawed one, that the fight against fascism abroad had coexisted with systemic racism at home. In 1973, the Navy commissioned the USS Miller, a Knox-class destroyer escort. The ship's sponsor was Miller's niece, who broke a champagne bottle against the hull during the christening ceremony in Long Beach, California. The event received modest press coverage, a brief acknowledgement of a man who had been dead for 30 years. The Miller served for 2 decades, participating in operations across the Pacific and Atlantic. Her crew learned the story of the man for whom their ship was named, and some developed a sense of pride in serving aboard a vessel that honored a hero who had challenged the Navy's racial policies. When the ship was decommissioned in 1994, her bell and other artifacts were preserved and eventually placed in museums dedicated to naval history. But naming a ship was not the same as confronting the systemic failures that had defined Miller's service. It was commemoration without reckoning, a gesture that allowed the Navy to honor Miller while avoiding difficult questions about how many other black sailors had been denied opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. The real reckoning began in the 1990s, when the Department of Defense commissioned studies to examine whether racial prejudice had influenced the awarding of military decorations. These studies found clear evidence that Black, Hispanic, Asian American, and Native American servicemen had been systematically undervalued in the medal process. Heroic actions that would have earned white servicemen the Medal of Honor had resulted in lesser awards, or no recognition at all, for servicemen of color. The most comprehensive of these studies focused on Asian American servicemen, particularly those who had served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. In 1996, Congress directed the Army to review the service records of Asian Americans who had received the Distinguished Service Cross during World War II. The review identified 22 cases where the award should have been upgraded to the Medal of Honor. In June of 2000, President Bill Clinton presented those medals in a ceremony at the White House. Similar reviews were conducted for other groups. 7 black soldiers from World War II received belated Medals of Honor in 1997 after a study concluded that racial prejudice had prevented their proper recognition. The review process was imperfect, limited by incomplete records and the passage of time, but it represented an institutional acknowledgement that discrimination had shaped military recognition systems. Miller's case was examined during these reviews, but his Navy Cross was not upgraded. The reasons were never fully explained, though analysts suggested that the threshold for the Medal of Honor required sustained action over an extended period, not a single act of courage, however dramatic. Critics argued that this distinction was applied selectively, that white servicemen had received the Medal of Honor for actions comparable to or less significant than Miller's. The debate over Miller's proper recognition continued into the 21st century. In 2020, the Navy announced that a Ford-class aircraft carrier would be named USS Doris Miller, the first carrier to bear the name of an enlisted sailor and the first named for a black American. The announcement came amid a broader national conversation about racial justice, following protests over police brutality and systemic racism. The decision to name a carrier after Miller was seen by many as the Navy finally giving him the recognition he deserved. The Ford-class carriers are the most advanced warships ever built, equipped with electromagnetic catapults, advanced radar systems, and the capacity to launch and recover aircraft at unprecedented rates. To name such a ship after a man who had been relegated to mess duty was a powerful, symbolic statement. But symbols, however powerful, cannot change the past. Doris Miller never commanded a ship. He never trained gunners. He never received the opportunities his heroism should have earned. He died at 24, his potential unfulfilled, his capabilities never fully utilized by a Navy that could not see past the color of his skin. The ships that bear his name sail in a Navy that has changed profoundly since 1941. Today's Navy is integrated, with black sailors serving at every rank and in every specialty. The position of Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the service, has been held by officers of diverse backgrounds. The messman branch that confined Miller no longer exists. These changes did not come easily or quickly. They were the result of decades of struggle, of court cases and congressional action, of protests and pressure from civil rights organizations. They were driven by veterans who refused to accept second-class status, by activists who demanded that America live up to its stated ideals, by ordinary citizens who recognized that segregation weakened rather than strengthened the nation. Miller did not live to see this transformation, but his story was part of what made it possible. Every time the Navy was forced to acknowledge his heroism, it was also forced to confront the contradiction between that heroism and the policies that confined him. Every time his name was invoked in arguments for integration, it reminded people that talent and courage were not determined by race. The morning of December 7th, 1941, lasted less than 2 hours. The explosions and fires and chaos of Pearl Harbor ended by 10 o'clock, but the questions raised that morning about who was capable of defending the nation and who deserved the opportunity to serve in combat roles took decades to answer. Miller answered them in 15 minutes at a machine gun, in the moments he spent pulling wounded sailors to safety, in the hours he fought to save his ship and his shipmates. The Navy tried to contain that answer, to frame it as exceptional rather than representative, but the truth, once revealed, could not be hidden again. Today, the story of Pearl Harbor includes Doris Miller not as a footnote but as a central figure. His image appears in museums and textbooks. His name is taught to recruits at naval training centers. The carrier that will bear his name will sail for decades, a floating reminder of the cook who became a gunner when his ship needed him most. These tributes are meaningful. They represent progress. But they also remind us of what was lost, of the opportunities denied, of the lives cut short by policies built on prejudice. Miller should have trained generations of gunners. He should have risen through the ranks, his expertise recognized and utilized. He should have lived. Instead, he folded laundry and served meals, his capabilities wasted, his potential unrealized, until one morning when the world caught fire and he had no choice but to prove what he had always known, that courage and competence belong to no single race, that honor is earned through action rather than inheritance, that the measure of a man is found in what he does when everything is at stake. The ships burn still, in memory and history. The water of Pearl Harbor, once covered in oil and flame, is clear now, its surface reflecting the Arizona memorial that marks where 1,100 men remain entombed. Tourists visit, students learn, veterans salute. And somewhere in the depths, in the wreckage of the Liscum Bay 2,000 miles to the west, rests Doris Miller, 24 years old forever, a hero who deserved more than a medal, who earned more than commemoration, who proved something the Navy tried for decades to deny. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.